everyone. What I want to do in the next 20 minutes or so is take you through a story. It's a narrative about how we've embraced our status as a Vanguard council within the big society. It's one story, it's not the story, it doesn't define what the big society is on a national level. It just talks about how we've embraced it at our specific local geographical level. But it's a story about, I think, defining what the big society is in a specific area and looking at a different level of approach to council services, a different way of approaching council services and a different way of trying to involve people. Some background about us. We have a little bit of form before we became involved in the big society. We were the first council to post expenditure over £500 on the website. At this point, people usually groan or do something like that, because I know that you've had to do that at university. Well, most councils, all councils have had to do that, with the exception of one perhaps valiant attempt by Nottingham to resist the need to do this. And we were the first council in the country to incentivise residents through a recycle bank scheme. The intention here was to reward people with specific points for recycling. The more they recycled, the more points they got. These points could be exchanged in a variety of local stores, some of them quite large and well known, like Marks and Spencer's, others much, much smaller. And this has, in the year or so that it's been running, a year, 18 months it's been running, actually increased our recycling rate considerably. It's benefited local traders because the amount of spend tends to be much greater than the value of the points that are rewarded, and seems to be going down very well with residents, to the extent that one or two apocryphal stories exist about when relations come in to visit certain people who live in the borough, they bring their recycling with them to actually put into the residents' recycling. I should hasten to add that is an apocryphal story. Much of this work, both in terms of the recycle bank and what I'm about to talk to you about, is based around this book by Sunstein and Thaler, Nudge, or Nudge Theory. I think it's true to say that behavioural psychology is pretty well in its infancy in terms of, if you take public policy planning and applying it to try and change people's behaviours, we've only really started to look at this. And I know in the last sort of few years, and I know the Cabinet Office and their Behavioural Insight team, otherwise known as the Nudge team, are doing some quite interesting work around this in terms of how can you get people to opt in or opt out of particular things, whether it's being a donor, kidney donor or an organ donor, or whether it's actually getting them to engage in particular activity that's good for them and good for the state and society at the same time. So this is something that we are keen on pursuing and have been pursuing. It's really something that we think is about moving away from a simply consumerist model of society where residents passively accept and passively consume certain things that you're offering them, to one which there's much more perceived value in behaving in a specific way, both to the resident and to the council and to society, the community itself, really. Often unarticulated, people just see the benefit to them themselves, but nonetheless something that it does have much wider benefits than just the individual itself. Okay, a little bit more background. Big Society was launched in Liverpool in July 2010. As I said, we were chosen as a Vanguard Big Society Authority. And our approach was to define in the initial stage the local offer. And the way that we went about doing that was trying to put things in boxes. Why in boxes? Well, all this stuff was sort of floating around the ether about what big society could be, about what it was. You remember the huge plethora of articles that existed at this stage trying to define what this thing was. And the simple fact is that actually all of us in this room were engaged in big society prior to it coming along. And that is, we were doing existing things that actually supported volunteering, that supported some degree of philanthropic activity, that tried to look at actually strengthening local communities and building social capital. And in fact, if you look at this list here, this is a very standard list about what local authorities were doing. You in this room will be doing this, many of these things, I am sure. So you've got things like, using volunteers in libraries, for example. You've got things like foster caring, working with in leisure centres. The Adopt a Street thing is an environmental volunteering scheme. I want to come back to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But and then you've got a bunch of stuff around services, families and young people. So not a surprising list, but the first point for the Royal Borough is really to look at what we were doing and trying to build on it. And indeed, I'm sure many of you around this room were trying to establish a similar narrative. But we also, at the same time, when my leader and cabinet members stood up in Liverpool, they announced they were going to do a series of projects. And there are 10 projects there that actually formed part and parcel, and still do form part and parcel, of our Big Society offer. Now, I don't intend to go through every single one of those 10, because I think that actually to try and illustrate to you what we've been doing and trying to illustrate to you the transformational nature of some of these projects, we only need to pick a few out. And I want to pick out 4. So Adopt a Street, devolution to parishes, not a new thing, and in fact over lunchtime I was speaking to representatives from both Buckinghamshire and Cornwall. I know are doing work in this area, and I'm sure many of you others are. Incentivisation, a scheme that we're working on with Nectar, which takes this idea about trying to nudge people into certain types of behaviour a little bit further. Project Care Bank, which is a Japanese idea. It comes from Japan, and it's about actually a time banking scheme, which you may find of interest. If you want any further information on any of the other schemes that are shown, there is the details of the website. Please do have a look at it. There isn't much information on it that relates to the whole of our Big Society offer. But if we go back to these 4 schemes here to give you some idea